In medieval Europe, few weapons caused as much fear and anger as the crossbow. It did not have the prestige of the sword or the image of the knight's lance, but it changed warfare in a very real way. With the right shot, an ordinary soldier could threaten a heavily armored noble, and that made the crossbow one of the most hated weapons of the Middle Ages. To understand why, you have to look at how it worked, why it was so effective, and why so many people wanted it banned. Number 1. Why they hated it. The weapon that probably earned more real hatred than any other in medieval Europe was not the sword, not the axe, and not even the mace. It was the crossbow. That sounds strange at first, because the crossbow does not look especially glamorous. It does not carry the same noble image as a knight with a lance. It does not fit the later myth of face-to-face heroic combat. But that is exactly the point. The crossbow was hated because it cut through the social rules that made knightly warfare feel controlled, prestigious, and expensive. A mounted nobleman could spend years learning to fight on horseback, wear armor that cost a fortune, and ride into battle believing that his class owned war. Then a man on foot, with less status, less training, and far less money behind him, could drop him with a bolt. Medieval elites noticed that immediately. Church authorities noticed it too. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council condemned the murderous art of crossbowmen and archers against Christians and Catholics, and Britannica also notes that the crossbow was outlawed, at least for use against Christians, by the Lateran Council of 1139. That kind of language tells you this was not treated like just another tool of war. It was treated like a problem. And the deeper reason was not only morality, it was power. The crossbow directly threatened the dominance of the mounted elite. It made battlefield violence less dependent on noble birth, lifelong martial training, and the expensive culture of chivalry. When people call it the most hated medieval weapon, that idea is not just dramatic wording. It fits the record. Few weapons were condemned so openly, feared so broadly, and used so persistently anyway. Number 2. Built like a machine. The crossbow was basically a bow mounted across a stock, but that simple description hides why it mattered so much. The stock had a groove for a short projectile called a bolt, a locking mechanism to hold the string once drawn, and a trigger to release it. That meant the shooter did not have to hold all the tension with his own muscles at the exact moment of aiming. The weapon could store force mechanically and then release it on command. That was a big deal. With an ordinary bow, power came directly from the archer's body in one hard movement. With a crossbow, the draw could be built up with tools. Early users could brace the weapon with a stirrup and use a belt hook to draw the string. Later and stronger versions used cranks, windlasses, and rack and pinion devices such as the cranaquin. In plain terms, the weapon became a machine for multiplying human strength. That is why later medieval crossbows, especially the heavier forms often called arbalests, could grow much more powerful than a hand-drawn bow of the same size. Britannica notes that mechanical cocking aids freed the crossbow from the limits of simple muscular strength, and by the late Middle Ages, some heavy examples used extremely high draw forces. The best versions were not crude peasant tools. They were advanced pieces of military engineering, often using high-quality composite or steel bows and carefully made trigger systems. So the fear around the crossbow was never just about one lucky shot. It was about the fact that this weapon turned stored mechanical energy into repeatable killing power. It let a soldier prepare the shot, hold the weapon ready, and release at the right second instead of relying only on raw physical strength in one instant. Once you see it that way, the medieval crossbow stops looking like just another bow and starts looking like what it really was for its time: a portable killing machine. Number 3. Easy to scale. The crossbow worked because it solved problems that medieval armies constantly faced. Armies needed men who could become useful in a reasonable amount of time. They needed weapons that could threaten armored opponents. They needed something towns, lords, and rulers could buy in numbers. The crossbow answered all three. Britannica puts it very clearly. Crossbows were capable of killing the most powerful mounted warriors. They were far cheaper than war horses and armor, and they were much easier to master than the skills of mounted combat. It was also easier to learn to fire a crossbow than a longbow of equivalent power. That does not mean anybody could pick one up and instantly become deadly. Good crossbowmen still needed drill, discipline, distance judgment, timing, and nerve. But the training curve was very different. A strong military longbow demanded years of practice and a body shaped by that practice. A serious crossbow asked for competence, not a lifetime physical commitment on the same level. That mattered in a world where rulers often had to expand forces quickly. It also mattered in towns. The Metropolitan Museum notes that many urban communities across Europe required inhabitants to keep arms and armor, stored extra crossbows in city arsenals, and maintained them through specialists paid by the city. The weapon fit urban life because it offered practical military value without demanding that every useful adult male become an elite bowman or a mounted warrior. That made it scalable. A ruler or city council could think in numbers. How many weapons, how many bolts, how many men on the wall, how many trained guards by next season. In other words, the crossbow was efficient not just on the battlefield, but inside the military system around the battlefield. It matched the needs of cities, garrisons, mercenaries, militias, and princes who wanted results faster than old aristocratic training models could provide. That is why the weapon kept spreading, even when moral objections followed it everywhere. Number 4. Armor race. A big part of the crossbow's reputation came from what it could do to armor, or at least what people believed it could do when used well at the right range. Britannica states that the bolt of the medieval crossbow could pierce chainmail, and the Metropolitan Museum says that by the 14th century, the improved crossbow could pierce shields and mail armor. That alone was enough to change how people thought about survival in battle. Once a weapon can reliably threaten mail, shields, and exposed parts of the body, the answer is obvious: better protection. The Met points to that reaction directly. Knights turned toward coats of plates, more developed limb defenses, and eventually more extensive plate armor. Another Britannica article goes even further, saying that the spread of the crossbow obliged mounted knights to adopt heavier armor and therefore stronger and more numerous horses, making warfare more expensive and more professional. That is one of the clearest signs that this weapon really mattered. Medieval people do not redesign military equipment on a huge scale for no reason. Now, it is important not to turn this into a fantasy claim that every crossbow bolt punched straight through every plate harness. Real combat was more complicated than that. Distance mattered, angle mattered, armor quality mattered, the exact weapon mattered. But the crossbow did not need to make armor useless to become terrifying. It only had to make older protection less secure and force warriors into an expensive arms race. And even when armor improved, there were still faces, joints, horses, and moments of vulnerability. A knight did not have to believe the bolt would always go through everything. He only had to know that it might go through enough. That uncertainty, backed by real evidence of penetration, was part of what gave the crossbow its ugly reputation. Number 5. Where it shined. The crossbow was not unbeatable, and understanding its limits actually explains its success better. In open ground against first-rate longbowmen, especially if speed of fire decided the fight, the crossbow could be at a disadvantage. Britannica says serious war bows had advantages in range, accuracy, and maximum rate of fire, while ordinary military crossbows were shorter-ranged, less accurate, and slower to reload. But that same source also says the crossbow became the ideal missile weapon for positional and guerrilla warfare. That points to the environments where it really shined in medieval Europe. Castles, town walls, bridges, streets, narrow approaches, siege lines, defensive positions. Any place where cover, timing, and controlled fields of fire mattered more than sheer volume of shooting. Britannica Kids notes that the crossbow could be fired from behind a parapet, and that detail matters more than it may seem. A shooter could cock the weapon, keep it ready, stay protected, and wait for the right target. During sieges or while defending walls, that was a huge advantage. It also made ambushes and guarded choke points more practical, because the shot could be prepared before the target fully exposed himself. The pavis made the system even better. Royal Armories explains that pavises could be large enough to cover a crouching man completely, and crossbowmen could hide behind them while reloading. The Met likewise notes that some pavises were fitted with props so they could stand on their own.
So even though the crossbow was slower than a powerful handbow, it paired extremely well with cover and preparation. That combination made it nasty in the kinds of fighting medieval Europe saw all the time, because the Middle Ages were not made only of dramatic cavalry charges on open fields. They were full of sieges, fortified towns, ambushes, raids, and defensive warfare. In that world, a weapon that could wait in safety and hit hard on demand was exactly the kind of weapon that kept surviving. Number 6. City muscle. One reason the crossbow feels so medieval is that it fit the growth of medieval European cities almost perfectly. The Met study of European crossbows says the weapon's history is closely connected to the rise of medieval and early modern cities from the 12th through the 15th centuries. That is a major point. The crossbow was not only a field weapon, it was a civic weapon. Urban communities had walls to defend, gates to guard, wealth to protect, and political rivals to worry about. According to the Met, many towns required inhabitants to buy and maintain arms, stored additional crossbows in arsenals, paid crossbow makers to keep weapons functional, and encouraged or even mandated practice. The same study notes that these gatherings led to societies of crossbowmen in many cities across continental Europe. So the crossbow was not some marginal, dirty weapon used only by desperate men. In many places, it was built into the organized life of the town. That matters because it changes how we picture medieval soldiers. Not every useful fighter was a lord's retainer or a knight's follower. Many were townsmen, guards, watchmen, militia members, or professionals tied to urban power. The crossbow matched that world. It could be stored, inspected, repaired, issued, and practiced with in a disciplined civic setting. It also suited mercenary traditions.
Famous Italian and especially Genoese crossbowmen earned reputations as professionals, and the weapon became part of the wider shift toward paid, organized infantry service. So, when people imagine the crossbow as a shortcut weapon, they miss the bigger truth. It was simple to scale, but it also sat inside a culture of routine, maintenance, drills, contracts, and city administration. That is a stronger foundation than hero stories. A sword can symbolize status. A crossbow can anchor a system. Medieval Europe ended up needing that system more and more, especially as war became more frequent, more technical, and more expensive. Number 7. The Crecy lesson. One of the most useful things to understand is that the crossbow's bad moments do not prove it was overrated. They show how dependent it was on proper conditions. The classic example is the Battle of Crecy in 1346. Britannica says the Italian crossbowmen in French service began the assault on the English position, but were routed by the archers and then fell back into the path of the French cavalry. In the broader military article, Britannica adds that the victory at Crecy, where English longbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms beat French chivalry supported by Genoese crossbowmen, marked the end of massed cavalry charges by European knights for a long time. What does that tell us? First, it tells us that crossbows were important enough to be used by major armies in one of the most famous battles of the age. Second, it tells us that a crossbow was not magic. Skilled longbowmen could shoot faster, farther, and more accurately in the open. If crossbowmen were badly deployed, unsupported, exhausted, or forced into an unfavorable fight, they could collapse. That is not a contradiction, it is the point. Medieval weapons worked inside tactical systems. The longbow was better for some battlefield roles. The crossbow was better for others.
Crecy exposed the crossbow's weaknesses in open field conditions against elite archers, but it did not erase the weapon's value in sieges, on walls, in towns, or in disciplined defensive warfare. In fact, if the crossbow had really been a bad weapon, Europe would not have kept using and improving it for centuries after that battle. Its failure at Crecy is best read as a lesson in context. A slower weapon that hits hard needs cover, time, and organization. Remove those things, and you expose the shooter. Give them back, and the crossbow becomes dangerous again very quickly. That is why professional crossbowmen mattered most when commanders used terrain, shields, and timing intelligently, instead of throwing them forward as if every missile troop fought the same way. Number 8. No one was safe. Nothing proves the crossbow's seriousness better than the fact that rulers themselves could not stay above its reach. Britannica's biography of Richard I says he was fatally wounded in 1199 while besieging the castle of the Vicomte of Limoges, and other Britannica material identifies a crossbow bolt as the shot that killed him. That matters because Richard was not just any noble. He was Richard the Lionheart, one of the most famous warrior kings in medieval Europe, a man later legend wrapped in knightly glory. Even he could be taken down by missile fire during a siege. That is exactly the kind of thing that made the crossbow feel so offensive to elite values. It ignored status. It ignored reputation. It ignored the image of honorable combat controlled by rank. And the reaction to the weapon was full of hypocrisy. Authorities banned it or denounced it when it threatened Christians and nobles, but accepted it when it was useful. Britannica notes that although the crossbow was banned by the Second Lateran Council, it proved useful in the Crusades against the infidel and could not be eradicated anyway. The same Britannica passage says Emperor Conrad III forbade it in his realms, which shows how seriously rulers took the threat, but prohibition still failed. That is a pattern you see again and again in military history. Once a weapon offers a practical advantage, moral outrage usually loses to necessity. Medieval rulers could dislike the crossbow, fear it, condemn it, and still rely on it. They needed fortress defense. They needed sieges won. They needed trained infantry that could hurt armored enemies. So the crossbow survived every complaint because it answered real military needs more effectively than moral language could stop it. That is one reason its reputation stayed so dark. People kept saying it was wrong, and then kept loading it anyway. Number 9. War got bigger. The crossbow did not destroy knighthood overnight. and it did not single-handedly end cavalry warfare. Medieval change was never that simple. But the weapon was part of a larger shift that slowly pulled military power away from the exclusive world of the mounted aristocrat. Britannica explicitly describes an infantry revolution, in which the crossbow was one of the first key developments, helping infantry elites move toward tactical dominance. That wording matters because it places the crossbow inside a broad transformation instead of treating it as a curiosity. The weapon made it easier for organized foot soldiers to threaten men who had once seemed almost untouchable. The Italian history article from Britannica shows another side of that change by connecting the diffusion of the crossbow with heavier armor, stronger horses, higher military costs, and a more professional style of warfare in which mercenary troops increasingly replaced older citizen militias. The Met's crossbow study adds the urban side, showing how cities built arsenals, regulation, practice culture, and specialist maintenance around the weapon. Put that together, and the picture becomes clear.
The crossbow helped push medieval warfare towards systems that were less personal and more institutional. More money, more organization, more technical equipment, more paid troops, more emphasis on walls, logistics, and disciplined infantry action. It also helped normalize the idea that a mechanically efficient weapon in trained hands could matter more than aristocratic style. The knight did not disappear, but he no longer had the same monopoly on battlefield threat. Once that monopoly cracked, other developments followed more easily: stronger pike formations, more effective missile infantry, and, eventually, gunpowder weapons that expanded the same basic lesson. The crossbow was not the end of the old order by itself. It was one of the sharpest tools that opened the old order up. Number 10. The real reason. The deepest reason the crossbow became the most hated medieval weapon is that it exposed what mattered more than honor in real war. It was not loved because it was beautiful. It was not feared because it looked dramatic. It was feared because it turned calculation into killing power. You could teach it faster than elite archery. You could issue it to townsmen and mercenaries. You could use it from walls, behind shields, and inside the slow, grinding reality of siege warfare that shaped so much of medieval Europe. It could threaten mail, shields, exposed gaps, and sometimes much more. It forced armor to improve. It increased the cost of war. It helped cities defend themselves and rulers build more professional forces. And because the trigger held the drawn string, it let violence wait in a controlled, mechanical form until the exact second a target appeared. That is why medieval elites reacted so strongly. The crossbow was not just another weapon in the rack. It was a challenge to the social logic of war. A knight wanted battle to reward class, training, horses, lineage, and the visible performance of courage. The crossbow rewarded preparation, position, engineering, and disciplined timing. That was a different world. Even its long life says something. The Met notes that crossbows remained dominant for centuries, and Britannica says their technical development toward greater power continued until they were eventually replaced by firearms, such as the harquebus and musket. So when people remember the crossbow as cruel, unfair, or dishonorable, they are really remembering something else underneath those words. They are remembering a machine that let ordinary men take part in killing power once claimed by armored elites. In medieval Europe, very few weapons did that so clearly, and very few were hated for exactly that reason.